Having looked at what the right thing to do is from an ethical perspective and established the basis of how we decide the right thing from a legal perspective by looking at Australia's legal system, the next two modules are going to look at a specific area, rights and obligations in business, namely contract. Now, it may seem obvious, but having an agreement that you can count on is super important in business, and that's why we treat it as one of those key rights and obligations. Why rights and obligations? Well, on the one hand, it's your right to get what you agreed to have delivered to you, but on the other, it's your obligation to deliver what you agreed to. So there's this dual nature of it. And so really, contract is an extension of that ethical idea that you should keep your word. And this is an area where we get a divergence between what is ethical, keeping your word, and what is legal. Do you have a contractual agreement in place? And that's what these 2 weeks are about, to help us distinguish between the two. Specifically, by looking at that divergence, when do you have to keep your word as to what you said you would do from a legal perspective versus other perspectives, be they strategic or ethical? So let's get into it. Let's have a look at contract law. As I was saying, contract is central to business, and we're going to try and do 5 things in 2 weeks. As you can understand, 2 weeks is not a lot of time to cover such a complex subject. In fact, law students, back in my day, we used to spend a whole year. It was a year long, so equivalent of 2 subjects for a semester to do contract law. So there's going to be some areas that we skate over pretty thinly, and I'm going to point you to what we concentrate on. Now remember, there are 3 things that we're trying to do. Number 1 is we're trying to give you a sense of how you can take on advice and what you should have a general of awareness of in business. Second, we want to demonstrate a way of thinking logically. So we choose a couple of areas of law in particular that might be a little bit outdated or seem a little tangential, but we're doing them because of the tests involved that require a certain logic and to help you to develop these thinking skills and logic. Third, some elements of the technical knowledge behind contract law. And in doing this, we hope to hit 5 aims. 1, you'll know what a contract is. 2, you'll know what you need to do to form a contract. 2, you'll know what you need to do to form a legal contract. 3, you'll be able to differentiate the circumstances where it might not be enforceable, even though it looks like you got a contract, some rare circumstances that you should be aware of so that you don't fall into any traps. 4, we're going to learn what you actually agreed to, what are the terms of the contract, and 5, what happens if someone doesn't keep their word in a contract? What are your remedies? So, what is a contract? How do you form it? When might it not be enforceable? What's in it? What happens if someone doesn't keep their end of the bargain? 5 key insights that we hope you can get from these 2 modules stacked together. So because there is so much, the first module only concentrates on the first half. How do you make sure you've got an enforceable contract? And the starting point for that is understanding what a contract is. So to help us work through this material, I thought we could have an example. Let's call it the espresso machine drama. So imagine it's Monday morning and Jordan, who's a 17-year-old owner of the super trendy cafe Perky Beans, is scrolling Instagram where Perkalicious Limited, a coffee machine supplier, has just dropped a new post. New Pro X espresso machine, $4,000 while stocks last. This is a machine Jordan's been dreaming about. Without hesitating, he DMs Perkalicious, "I'll take one if you can deliver by Friday." Tuesday morning, Perkalicious replies, "Deal, just confirm by email so we can process your order." Jordan fires off the email that afternoon, but it bounces. Perkalicious's inbox is overflowing. Jordan shrugs, figures it'll sort itself out. Meanwhile, Percolicious sells the last Pro X to another buyer with no heads up to Jordan. By Wednesday, Jordan's trying again, and given this stuff up, he wants it for free, right? Thinking he's bought it up here. And I'll put your logo on our counter for 6 months. So I want it for free, and I'm going to put your logo. Okay, so he's going to put the logo on. If you don't do that, I'm going to blast my followers, telling them exactly how you can't be trusted. Percolicious bites. Okay, sending the invoice to confirm now. Don't know where they're going to get one from, but they're going to get one because of they're worried about their reputation. The invoice lands with a note at the bottom, subject to final contract. So on the one hand, that's a fairly convoluted scenario going on here. But on the other, there's many things going on here that are quite regular in business. People advertising, people trying to buy something, mistakes being made, emails going awry, people selling to other people, the last of their stock, etc. People getting upset and coming back, wanting people to make amends for things that they perceive as being done wrong. So there's a whole lot of stuff going in. And as we go through this module, hopefully we'll be able to use this example to show how the topics that we're dealing with help you understand what's going on and what you should do when you're in business in situations that are like this or simpler or even more complex. So let's get into it. At its heart, business is about making deals, and if you want to make deals that you can count on, you need a contract. Why? Because a contract is a legally enforceable agreement. That's what makes it different, right? If you agree with your sibling that they're going to wash your bike for $10, no one really expects that that's going to be legally enforceable. It's an agreement, but it's not legally enforceable. And that's the big distinction, right? It's that distinction between, what might be ethical and what is legal. It's that distinction between arguing with your sibling that they really should keep their word, an ethical perspective, and the fact that you can take them to court if they don't keep their word, which is a legal perspective, okay? So this is the key distinction and why it's central to business and central to understanding your rights and obligations and what you have to do to be a good business citizen. Okay, it's pretty simple what a contract is, a legally enforceable agreement. But while that might be simple, there are lots of misconceptions about what you have to have a contract. For instance, some people think that contracts need to be written, signed documents. They don't, most of the time. In fact, most of the contracts we deal with every day are going to be either verbal or even implied by conduct with no one actually speaking, something we'll get into. That's because in most consumer transactions, what we're actually dealing with is a contract that is formed and performed at the same time. So when you go and buy a cup of coffee, you form the contract. As you buy the coffee, they make it and give it to you. So there's often not a lot of chances of things going wrong in those kinds of circumstances. And very clearly, when you buy a cup of coffee, you're not actually writing, I agree to buy a cup of coffee. But there is a legal contract there with legal implications, for instance, if they poisoned you, etc., which we won't get into at the moment. But it's really important to understand that just because there's nothing in writing doesn't mean there's not a legal contract. So when you look at that breadth of topics that are covered that are contracts, everything from buying a coffee to getting some chips at the vending machine, any kind of commercial transaction is going to be contractual. You start thinking maybe everything's a contract. No, it isn't. And we've got a couple of examples here where we'll get into why, but agreements to sell your phone to your friend at the pub is probably not going to be a contract. When someone advertises a product and you instantly agree to buy it at that price, you probably don't have a contract, etc. We'll get into those. So this is why the distinction's important. Some things that look like contracts actually aren't. And some things that you may think aren't contracts actually are. And so understanding this difference becomes super important. And so to help us through this, I've got this diagram for the rest of Module 5, right? It looks pretty complicated, but I think by the end of it, it should make sense to you. Not going to go through the footnotes in great detail, but I will take a little bit of time to explain it to you. So there's many ways to think about contract law. There isn't only one way, so you might have run across the topic before, either in a subject or at school, etc. And this might be a bit different, right? But our aim here is to give you a conceptual understanding rather than a deep, detailed understanding like a lawyer would have. And in essence, we're saying that there's 3 steps. The first step is that you must have formed what's called a simple apparent contract. So it's got to be something that looks like a contract. That's the first step. And to have a simple apparent contract, you need 3 things: agreement and intent and consideration. If one of those 3 is missing, you don't have a contract forming. Okay. So you can't have a contract. So you've got to have all 3. These ands are super important. So just say you've got agreement, intent, and consideration. The second thing you've got to ask yourself, is it a valid contract? Now, why might it not be valid? Okay, the 2 major reasons that you might run across are capacity, right? So if it was a 2-year-old making a contract, well, 2-year-old might agree. They even might intend let's go with 7-year-old. They might agree. There might be some intent that they're going to follow through and they might have paid for it, but we would say that they don't really know what they're doing. So capacity, lawful object, right? The courts are not going to uphold a drug deal, and formalities. So there are some very specific types of contract where what I said before about it not being in writing, that's an exception. Okay, we're not dealing with these 3 things in any detail in this subject. You just need to be aware that if a 7-year-old enters a contract, you're not going to have a contract. There are some instances where you lack intellectual capacity, where perhaps you might be suffering from intoxication. That could be a place too. Lawful objects, it's pretty clear the courts aren't going to uphold anything that's illegal. And you need to be aware that some things like land contracts and guarantees, etc., require to be in writing. They need some, and sometimes in a certain form. So there's some rare exceptions. That's a big asterisk, this one. You can almost forget about it for our subject, but it's there for the lawyers amongst us. Okay. So we've got a simple apparent contract. We've said it's valid. The people have capacity, it's not unlawful, etc. Then the third and final step, we've got to look for what they call vitiating factors. Did people really agree? So we revisit, we say, is there real agreement? Why might there not be a real agreement? You force someone into it, duress, you influence them to the point that they really didn't use their own thinking. We'll get to that. You acted unconscionably, you pressured them in a certain way, or you lied to them, misrepresentation. Now, we are going to concentrate on these 2 here. I think they're far more applicable to the business setting. I hope you are not going to threaten to kill someone if they don't enter a contract. And I hope you understand that if you falsely lie to people about things, it'll come back to bite you legally. There are some instances of misrepresentation. I understand innocent misrepresentation and negligent misrepresentation we do cover. So that's why we do cover that when we do negligence. So that's why we're not really going to touch on misrepresentation either. Okay, so you've got to know, have you formed a contract? Agreement, intent, consideration. Is it valid? We don't deal with that. Are there any factors that might cause you to think, well, we didn't really agree? Undue influence, unconscionability. They're the 5 key topics that we're going to look at. And there's a logical structure and flow as to how we have to think about them when we're working through a particular problem. And we will start on that flow in the next video when we start looking at a simple apparent contract and the 3 requirements: agreement, intent, and consideration.